How's everyone doing? Good? Good, good. Thank you for the intro. Brilliant talk, so I really enjoyed it. It's nice to have something really practical and tangible. I'm going to be a bit more theoretical now and kind of talk a bit about culture, because as a thing it is a bit more nebulous. So, building culture. I'll be talking first about how do you define culture. This is a very nebulous thing. Second of all, then working out, because there's a lot of different types of cultures as well, so you've got to define not only what is culture, but then what your culture, which you want to produce, is. Then we're talking about how do you communicate that culture once you know who you want to be, and walk you through some examples of our culture. And then finally, it's how do you embed it. So a lot of the things that you've heard today, such as a lot of what Scott's been talking about, Ted's been talking about in terms of like glory walls, that sort of thing, they're great examples of how you can embed the culture. So a little bit about OneFineStay. What we do is we're effectively like we're hotel chains that exist in people's homes. So our tagline is handmade hospitality in the finest homes. And so what we do is we do, as a guest, when you stay with us, you'll get a whole home, you'll get a beautiful home. You'll make sure that it's all completely working, crafted. We'll go in, we'll clean the home professionally, properly deep clean it. If the boiler breaks, we'll go in, we'll fix the boiler. It's a very hands-on and high-touch service. If there's any problem day or night, you just call us and we're on it. That makes a very interesting type of culture within our business, because we're not a pure tech business. And it's interesting because it's very much a service culture business, and there's a lot of other businesses coming. So Amazon, they aren't necessarily a pure tech business. Reality, they're heavily dominant on customer experience, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. Deliveroo, other companies like this, and Uber, fundamentally, you keep going back to these companies because of the real world experiences. You trust them, you love them. And so that's where I'm coming from with this, because our culture is so important to us, because we aren't necessarily just a small team. So we are 6 years old, we've got about 800 people, 350 of which are things like engineers, developers, marketeers, that sort of thing, and then you've got about 500 of which are logistics people, so drivers, cleaners, that sort of thing. But all of that, because people are from so many different backgrounds, like hotel backgrounds, things like that, they don't necessarily know the norms of how to run things like Scrum or get involved with that sort of thing. So for us, it's hugely important to get everyone up to speed on kind of how a company should run. So, what is culture? So it's typically a very nebulous thing. Is culture this? It's not usually little dogs and high fives and things like that. It's a lot more than that. It's a lot more than, say, ping pong tables in your office, or like office rooms made of spaceships, that sort of thing. They're the kind of things which large companies, they kind of try to have it there in order to have everyone embedded in a certain type of culture, or to make you feel like you're in a really energetic and enthusiastic startup culture. But that's not really what it is. What it is, and I put quotes around this to make it seem more legit, but in fact it's just my definition. But for the purpose of this talk, it's a way a collective of people make decisions. So being a product manager is particularly hard because day after day you're making decisions. And decisions are really tiring. They're also really hard to come to grips with. So you could, for instance, choose, right, I am going to launch this product tomorrow just so I can get some data on it, or I can spend an extra 2 days fixing the things which we saw in user testing, which are just obvious, which we should fix and are going to massively skew the results anyway. Like, whether you land on each of those arguments, it's kind of nebulous and it's kind of a trade-off. And your results as a product manager are based off each of those small decisions. And that's interesting about culture, is that it's the sum of all of those decisions, where people end up on that line day after day, and how that sums up across your entire business. So a lot of people also talk about product-driven cultures versus customer-driven cultures and things like that. So here's a quick outline of how and what the definition is of each of these types of cultures. So a lot of companies want to be a product-driven culture, and especially a lot of CEOs, right? They want to be like the asshole CEO who's an absolute genius, and they make what customers want you to build. Apple, perfect example of this, right? It's like before, and what they do is they create markets. So before the personal computer, nobody was spending money on personal computers. Nobody had that habit. But Apple came along and they produced this new capability. They created this new market and changed people's perceptions. And they did it through an incredible experience which changes people's habits. Similar to that, and by the way, this is also around where do ideas come from and where do you think about them. So another great example, which is always touted out, which is around like Henry Ford and the car. That's a great example of a product-driven culture. However, there are far more examples of customer-driven cultures. And so they're largely the same, except it's when you have an existing market. So for us, we're a customer-driven market. Amazon are a customer-driven market because you can't tell customers what they should be building or buying. So let's say Virgin, for instance, as an airline, if they started telling customers and tried forcing them to change their habits, they're not going to change their habits because their habits are ingrained. They're just going to go off to another airline. Whereas you can do that in a product-driven culture or a product-driven organization because those habits haven't formed yet. So this, for me, is like a really good contention, because a lot of people go on about, like, we've got to be a product-driven culture, but actually, often you want to be a customer-driven. Then you've got engineering-driven and sales-driven. These guys are typically around capability. Google's a classic example of an engineering culture. Perfect, where, like, you're just creating Google Maps or whatever. But that's an example with these guys, right? Is that there's nothing really that obviously links a lot of their products together other than the fact they have incredible engineers who are able to create these new products. Whereas on the sales-driven side, they have a very clearly defined audience, which is kind of office workers, and they will continue to create products which build on top of that. So that gives you a bit of context around, like, don't be ashamed of, like, being, and don't try and be a product-driven culture, or don't try and be anything you're not. Know which market you're in. Know what really makes your product unique, and then go with it. So, example of how to create and communicate a customer-driven culture. So, what we did, and don't do this, is we made a bunch of motivational pictures that were just a little bit prettier. And these don't really work. So they were great, and part of the problem is, and we called them the Magic 6, but actually there's only 4 of them on this slide because 6 is far too many. Like, the only use that we could have with them is we ended up having them in our hiring process, which was great. It meant that, and hiring's one of a fantastic place, and Pip mentioned this. If you can hire the right people, that culture continues to get embedded and continue to permeate by the very nature of the people. But that isn't quite enough to keep that culture alive. So instead what we did is we distilled it to heroism. So what we did, especially early on, it's all about customer insight. And so we developed this notion around being there with the customers. And so if the boiler breaks in the middle of the night, don't just go, oh, in the morning, these 4 boilers broke. Like, what you've got to do, and again, this is like a customer-driven culture, but if you're going to be making decisions every day, like, there's no point going to work and spending 24 hours at work and doing the hard things the hard way. Instead, focus on doing a few things the hard way. So with us, it's if the boiler breaks, go out there and be with the guest. Find out what they're experiencing at that time. And you'll soon get to learn. So this here is an NPS graph. It's a very bad visualization of one, but the great thing about heroism is it gives you so much insight about the customer. This is perfect really early on when you don't know much about your customer. You haven't yet quite got product market fit, but just get out there and get with people as quickly as possible. And what ends up happening is that you end up focusing on taking people who really, really potentially hate your product. So as James was mentioning earlier, like, people who have had a really terrible experience, and you can turn them around, and you learn how to turn them around. And you learn, like, so with the boiler example, like, you have 4 boilers break down, then all of a sudden you're thinking, and you should have learned this before then, but it's like, okay, this is a common intrinsic problem with our business. And so what should we do? Coming up to Christmas, we should check all the home's boilers for free. It solves the problem for the guests, and it solves the problem for us getting out in the middle of the night. However, this is really, really exhausting. So we've recently, at the beginning of this year, we completely changed our culture and how we embodied it. So we have an employee of the month type thing, and they all sound really like cringe, but they're a great way to tell and illustrate really good examples of what people within the business should be following and focusing on. The problem is in motivational pictures is that if someone's landing on the moon, it doesn't really, there's no one in your business, it's really hard to make that into your tangible day-to-day decisions. But that's the point of this, right, is that when I'm making a decision around, right, should I go and get more customer insight here, or should I go and get a bit more data, then you know. And so this is where we've changed, and we've moved to this notion of craft. And we've become, effectively, a customer-driven organization that validates using a data-driven. But the interesting thing about this is that this is perfect for later stage companies. And so you shouldn't go and become too data-driven too early on, because what ends up happening is you end up focusing on turning the people who are kind of interested in your business, and you make them kind of a little bit more interested in your business. You kind of move the needle a little bit. Whereas early on, what you should be doing is focusing on how do you take big swathes of part of the business, part of the market who don't really love you, and making them love you. But know what part of the stage of the business you're in, and then go and communicate that vision and communicate it appropriately within your teams. Right, 5 minutes, great. So then, how do you embed it in the process? Now, the interesting thing about this is, and so you've heard a lot about these processes before, and I think I mentioned around being a product manager, it can be extremely exhausting making all these decisions. And it's known as, you get this thing called decision fatigue. And it's like a classic example in law where judges after lunch end up making very different decisions as how they do before lunch. It's because they've been making decisions all day. And it's the same with your team. And so how can you pull in processes that kind of battle your cognitive biases and battle your classic habits? We all know as product managers about cognitive biases. So how do you fight those within your team? And this, for me, is a large part of what culture is. If you're a data-driven culture, then you can fight the biases which you have, which are typically inherent in a product-driven organization. You can go to, right, actually, no, we should be looking at the data here, and we shouldn't just be looking at, you'll see now. So, confirmation bias. So what I'm going to do is I'll run through for each of the different types of culture, what are the most common biases they end up falling prey to. So this is one for us, customer-driven. So this is a classic. So we have on our homepage a pop-up which goes, sign up to our mailing list. It pops up after about 30 seconds. Right, you can create a hypothesis, which is, right, after 30 seconds, people aren't really engaged with us. They don't really understand. So what do? If you're in a classic data-driven, hypothesis-driven, you go, okay, so I have an hypothesis, and I'm going to say, let's increase the pop-up time to a minute. You add it, you double it. That's great, but that falls prey to the confirmation bias, where you're looking for data to support your hypothesis. That's kind of okay, but what you should do is you should do an anti-hypothesis. So what you do is you also test that if you were to pop up 15 seconds after somebody lands, does it go down? Because to support your hypothesis, it has to go either way, right? You have to have both the positive and the negative. So every time you're doing A/B tests, make sure that you do anti-testing. And this is something which is a classic for us, where we're trying to be more data-driven now as opposed to insight-driven. And it's taking us time, but this sort of thing, as long as you've got it baked into your process, so every time that you're creating an A/B test, you go and do this properly. Another classic example in a product-driven is where you've got authority bias. And you've got your CEO, and he's the nuts, and he tells you exactly how it should be. Or you've got some design genius or a UX genius on the team, and they tell you how it should be. Problem is that although authorities are often very good, reality is they don't necessarily come up with the best ideas. So this is an example of something which we do here. It's called Crazy Eights. And this is to avoid us from being too
too reliant on any one particular person within the team, and instead get everyone involved. And it doesn't have to take long. And so basically, if you have a problem, you just get everyone who's working on that problem just to take some post-it notes and just to do 8 different versions. Like it doesn't matter how good or crazy they are, just make sure you do 8 of them. And it gives you, and it forces you out of your mental mode of just going, that's the answer, and that's the first idea which comes out of your head. Now, it may be that that first idea of the kind of UX leads idea comes out as winning and comes out as the best idea, but at least you know you've explored all the other avenues. And this is a really cheap and dirty way of doing it. It's why I've shown it as being very unglamorous. You don't need a whiteboard, you don't need a storyboard, you don't need anything. You just need to sit down there and take 5 minutes on it. Really, really good. Bandwagon bias is a classic in sales-driven cultures. Like with us, the reason why that's there is because other people do it. And like, how many people have had this, right? You have it all the time, especially from different areas of your culture, often from the sales organizations, right? They're like, hey, we should do this because our leading competitor is doing it. Like, we should do it because Booking.com is doing it, or whatever it is. And it's like, okay, they may be going well, but they're also a very different company. And although they may sell a similar product, the way they sell it's very different. The purchase path and purchase times for how they're doing these things are very different. So again, make sure whenever you do this stuff, you can take it, but take it with a pinch of salt, and then make sure you do A/B test it. If your CEO forces you to go and build something, make sure that you put it through your regular funnel, and you do A/B test everything, and you treat it with the same level of disdain in your prioritization process. Overconfidence bias. This is a classic one of engineering-driven cultures. It's like you don't expect that what is this? A tendency to believe ourselves less likely than others to experience negative life events. And it's like classic for engineers, constantly creating new framework after new framework after new framework. I can do it better than anyone else. Yeah, sure. I mean, it's a really good thing to have within your business because it means that you end up building new things, and so you have to have a little bit of confidence, but at the same time, you don't want to be reinventing the wheel all the time. So one, use other frameworks and things that exist out there, prototype them, and go from there. And that for us, there are some dangers with using prototypes, but we are extremely prototype heavy in our business. We have far too many Google spreadsheets and Google calendars on top. So that is largely it. So building culture, work out where you want to have that culture driving to. What is your focus right now? Whether it's insight-driven or data-driven, depending on your life stage in the business. And then what processes do you need to do in order to keep reinforcing that within the business? And then go and do it. It doesn't matter whether you're the CEO or anyone else, just get everyone involved and get everyone doing this. Because the point of a culture is that everyone is working in the same way and everyone is making the decisions the same way. And then when that happens, everyone pulls together much better. That's it. Thank you very much.